In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who was standing in a command bunker 6 minutes past dawn, watching the chrono when the first orbital impact shook the ferrocrete. 11 hours earlier, they'd been in the mess with a bottle of something that looked like hydraulic fluid, celebrating without joy. They had won. 7 months on the Grenden Highway, and the last Ork column had broken. The ships came down the next morning. They cheered. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Velke, 28, 4th Provincial, a cable worker before the war put a lasgun in his hands, with his old worker's token still hanging at his belt. His world held. His world won. And then he learned what the Imperium does with a population that has spent 7 months in close contact with the enemy, and what the word containment means when the perimeter is drawn around the defenders too. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first land strike from the relief fleet hit Corvinal at 6 minutes past dawn on the 3rd of Quintember. I know the time. The chrono bolted to the wall of Bastion 14 was the only piece of equipment in the room still doing what it was built to do, and when the ceiling came in, it stopped. 11 hours before that, the last Ork column had broken on the Grenden Highway. Less than 4 before that, someone in what was left of the officer's mess had pried open a bottle of something that tasted like hydraulic fluid and called it a celebration. We had won. The siege of Threnhaven was over. Corvinal was ours again. And then the sky caught fire, and it was not the greenskins doing the burning. It was the fleet. Our fleet. The one we had been praying for since the first Ork lander hit dirt 7 months ago. The relief fleet came to Threnhaven and its very first act, before a single shuttle touched our soil, before a single officer opened a single Vox channel to tell us anything at all, was to put a lance battery through the center of the city we had just bled dry to hold. I will get to that. But first, what it cost us to win, because without that, the rest of it is just a story about dying, and dying is cheap. Threnhaven is a civilized world in the Veldren subsector, or it was, depending on how you look at it. Manufacturing base. 3 mid-grade hive clusters along the Corvinal Basin, which is a stretch of arable ground between 2 mountain ranges that goes on for about 1,800 kilometers and does not do anything interesting at any point along the way. Population around 40 million before the Orks, which made it large enough to rate a planetary defense garrison, and small enough that nobody in Segmentum Command had thought about it twice in the last 900 years. We made turbine housings, industrial sealant, and a kind of pressed grain bar that tasted like chalk and was shipped off-world by the ton to feed people on planets that produced even less interesting food than we did. That was Threnhaven. That was home. I had spent 28 years there. 9 of them a child, 18 winding cable in the Corvinal South Industrial District, and the last one holding a rifle in the 4th Provincial, which is what happens to a man when the lottery finds his name and the appeals office does not find his paperwork. I will say one thing about the cable works now, and it will not mean anything to you yet. In my last 4 years on the floor, our shift returns were signed off by a man from the 5th sub-level whom none of us had met, and the tonnage we actually loaded onto the transit rails did not match the tonnage on the sheet, and we all knew it did not match, and every man on that floor decided independently that a discrepancy which arrives in your favor is not a discrepancy you report. We thought somebody upstairs was stealing. We were pleased about it. It meant the quota came down. The Orks came in the 8th month of the Threnhaven fiscal year, and they came the way Orks always come. Without warnings, without declarations, without any of the procedural theater that human wars are built on. They came as a sound first, a grinding, tearing, rumbling bass note that started somewhere in the upper atmosphere and did not stop. Then they came as light, which was the hulk breaking apart during entry. And then they came as fire, which was the debris field hitting the northern basin. And then they came as orcs, which is something no amount of training prepares a man for, since the training is built on the assumption that the enemy is doing something you can predict. The first greenskin I ever saw was standing in the middle of a 4-lane arterial road in the Corvinal commercial district, 9 feet tall and still smoldering from entry heat, holding a chopper the size of my torso in one hand and a smaller orc in the other. And it was screaming. Not in pain, not in rage exactly, in something that does not have a human word attached to it, in the pure mechanical joy of existing for the sole purpose of violence, in the way an engine sounds when it has been opened up past its tolerances and has not understood yet that it is destroying itself. Sergeant Prael put a round through its left eye from 60 meters, and it did not fall. It turned and looked at us with one ruined eye, and one that worked perfectly well, and it started moving in our direction, and that was the last time in 7 months that I thought about anything other than killing greenskins. The first 3 weeks of the invasion were not a siege. They were a disaster. The Hulk debris field had scattered orc landing pods across an area roughly the size of the Corvinal basin itself, and the number that came out of them was beyond anything our planetary command had modeled for. Later estimates, the kind assembled after the fact by people who were not there, put the initial landing force at somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 greenskins. That number meant nothing to me at the time. What meant something was that they were everywhere, all at once, in every district and every road and every building that had a door large enough for an orc to fit through. The 4th Provincial was a garrison force, 18,000 strong on paper and about 15,000 in practice. Peacetime garrison units are never at full strength, and nobody had cared enough to fix that before the Hulk hit. We had las guns, 2 heavy bolters per company, a handful of mortars, and exactly no experience fighting anything more aggressive than a dock worker's strike in a bad fiscal quarter. The 8th Veldren Rifles, the only proper guard regiment on the planet, had another 4,000. Against 300,000 orcs, that is not a ratio. That is a rounding error. Our commanding officer was a Major Thressin who had held the rank for 11 years without once being asked to do anything with it beyond signing requisition forms. And on the second day of the invasion, he stood up during an officer's briefing to ask a question about supply chain continuity, and a stray round from an orc shooter came through the window and took his head off. That was the moment the 4th Provincial stopped being a garrison force and started being whatever we were going to become, which was either dead or dangerous. And I did not have strong feelings about which one, as long as it happened quickly. Sergeant Prael saved us. I say that plainly because it is true, and Gavin Prael is dead and will not hear it and become insufferable about it, which he absolutely would have, being the most obnoxious competent man I have ever served under. He was not 4th Provincial. He was seconded from the 8th Veldren Rifles, a proper guard regiment that had been rotating through Threnhaven on garrison relief when the Hulk hit, and he had combat time on 3 worlds before ours. He was a short man with a broken nose and hands that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, and he ran our platoon from day 3 of the invasion, as though the preceding chaos had been a personal insult he intended to correct with violence and paperwork, in equal measure. He did not shout. He did not give speeches. He looked at a situation, identified the thing most likely to kill us, and then killed it first, and he expected us to keep up, or he would find men who could. By the fourth week, the Orks had consolidated. That is a generous word for what they actually did, which was crash into each other until the biggest ones started making the smaller ones do what they wanted, but the effect was the same. The scattered mobs became columns. The columns became a front, and the front pushed south toward Corvinal, where the most humans were. And Orks do not think about strategy in the way humans understand strategy. They think about noise. They think about density. They go where the fighting is, and if there is no fighting, they make some. And Corvinal had 3 hive clusters and 40 million people making a great deal of noise about not wanting to die. We lost the Corvinal North Industrial Zone in the 5th week. We lost the Paladin Bridge complex in the 6th. By the 8th week, the front had stabilized along the Grenden Highway, which was a 12-lane transit artery that ran east-west across the basin for 130 kilometers, and became, through no planning and no strategy, the line beyond which the Orks could not push us because there was nothing behind it except the Corvinal hive proper, and if that fell, there was nowhere else to go. The full Grenden Line was held by roughly 30,000 defenders in various states of organization, from intact 4th provincial companies with proper officers to armed factory workers in overalls who had been handed a las gun and pointed north. That was what was left. 3 weeks of fighting 300,000 greenskins in open urban terrain had reduced our combined forces by more than half. And the Orks had lost more than we had, but Orks do not measure loss the way humans do, and 300,000 minus 60,000 is still a number that makes 30,000 look like a clerical error. That was when the siege began. Not because anyone decided it was a siege, because the ground decided. Because the Orks were on one side of a road, and we were on the other, and neither of us could cross it without dying in numbers that even Orks found temporarily discouraging. 7 months on the Grenden Line. I will not take you through every day of it. Most days were the same, and the ones that were different in ways I do not enjoy thinking about. The Orks attacked. We killed them. They attacked again. We killed them again. They brought bigger Orks. We brought heavier guns, which we took from wrecked provincial vehicles and bolted to whatever piece of rubble seemed least likely to collapse that week. They brought crude armor, riveted plates on wheels with guns welded to the front, and we learned to aim for the welds, which were always the weakest point. And when the plates fell off, the Ork inside was usually so confused by daylight that you had a full second before it started swinging. The Munitorum had a term for this kind of warfare, attritional. Prael had a different term for it, which was the same word he used for a blocked latrine, and I will not repeat it here, but it was accurate. 7 months of killing greenskins does something to a man who was winding cable 14 months earlier. By the 3rd month, I could eat a ration pack 30 meters from a burning Ork corpse and not lose my appetite, not out of any hardness in me, but because the smell was just a smell and the corpse was just a corpse, and the ration pack was going to taste exactly the same either way. By the 5th month, I could put a last bolt through a Gretchen's chest at range and turn to Kosim and ask him whether he thought the water ration would come through before second watch, in the same breath, without feeling that 2 different activities had occurred. That is not courage. Courage has fright in it somewhere. There were 1,200 of us in Sector 9 at peak strength, which was week 9. That was our piece of the Grenden Line, 9 kilometers of highway between the Corvinal sealant works and the Paladin overpass, one stretch among 14 sectors that together held the full 130 kilometers. The sector command net told us there were similar numbers in each, though the net went down more often than it stayed up, and the numbers it reported were aspirational at best. Our 1,200 were 4th Provincial remnants, some 8th Veldrin rifle survivors like Priel, provincial defense stragglers from units that no longer existed, and a fair number of armed civilians who had decided independently that holding a gun was preferable to not holding one. We had no armor. We had no air support. What we had was one chimera that Essek had managed to keep running through a combination of mechanical knowledge, threats, and what I can only describe as an unreasonable personal relationship with an engine that should have died in the 5th week. The Mechanicus engineer attached to the 4th Provincial had been killed in the 2nd week of the invasion, and after that, Essek did whatever he wanted to that engine. He replaced parts with components the machine had not been built to accept. He bypassed systems he did not understand. Every one of those repairs was tech heresy of a kind that would have cost him his hands in peacetime, and nobody reported him, because the only man on the planet qualified to report him was in a crater in the northern basin, and the Chimera was the only armor we had. We held 9 kilometers of highway with infantry weapons and whatever the greenskins were kind enough to leave behind when they died, and we held it for 7 months. Nobody told us we could stop, and there was nothing behind us. Colonel Vaincord arrived in the 14th week. I did not know his name then. I did not know his rank, his unit, or where he had come from. What I knew was that a shuttle had landed behind our lines, which was the first Imperial aircraft I had seen in 3 months, and a man in a guard officer's uniform had stepped out of it looking like he had slept recently and eaten something that was not chalk, and Priel had looked at him with the expression he normally reserved for Ork armor welds. The colonel said he was there in an advisory capacity, attached to Segmentum Command, and that a relief fleet was being assembled and that our job was to hold until it arrived. He said this with the calm confidence of a man delivering good news, and every man in earshot believed him. After 14 weeks of chalk and greenskins, a clean uniform telling you help is coming is the closest thing to a religious experience a line soldier gets. I believed him too. Everything that came after is built on that, and it was a lie, and the lie was load-bearing. What Vaincord did on the Grenden Line was, in fairness, useful. He reorganized the command structure, which had been held together by Priel and 3 other sergeants operating on mutual stubbornness. He established proper rotation schedules so men could sleep for more than 2 hours without waking to an orc mob in the firing trench. He arranged supply drops, which arrived every 9 or 10 days by shuttle, and which contained ammunition, medical supplies, and a kind of nutrient paste that tasted marginally better than the chalk bars, and was, according to the label, fortified with 18 essential compounds that a human body requires to continue functioning. We did not ask where the shuttles came from. Gratitude is a wonderful anesthetic for curiosity. There was one thing Vaincord did that I did not understand at the time. In week 18, Priel proposed a sortie. The Orks had overextended a column into the Paladin district and left a gap in their northern line about 2 kilometers wide, and Priel wanted to punch a force through that gap and hit their supply dumps in the industrial zone. Not to hold ground, to scatter them. Break their concentration, force the smaller mobs to disperse, deny them the mass they needed to sustain a siege. It was the best tactical idea anyone had produced in 4 months, and Vaincord killed it. He said the risk of losing the sortie force in open ground was too high. He said our priority was to hold the Grenden Line, not extend beyond it. He said the Orks would reconsolidate within days anyway. Priel argued. Vaincord overruled him, calmly, by rank, and the sortie never happened, and the Ork column pulled back on its own, and the gap closed, and the siege went on for another 13 weeks. Priel did not speak to Vaincord for 3 days after that, I thought at the time that Vaincord was being cautious. I thought that later too. I stopped thinking it in the bunker. The fighting went on. Weeks 15 through 22 were the worst, if I am forced to rank them. That was when the Orks found their mech, and the mech found a way to make the crude armor actually work. Suddenly, the riveted plates were not falling off. Suddenly, the welds were holding. Suddenly, we were looking at vehicles that took 3 crack grenades to disable instead of 1 well-placed last bolt. And our supply of crack grenades was not increasing at the rate the Ork armor was. Somewhere in that stretch, a company of provincial defense came up from the Corvinal South sublevels to reinforce our sector and were put in on our right for 9 days. They kept to themselves, worked well, took their losses without complaint, and every one of them was related to at least one other. Same jaw, same set of the shoulders. Half my own platoon had come off the Corvinal South rolls the same as I had, and none of us thought anything of a sub-level company on our flank, except that it was men from home. Prael said sub-level families intermarry for generations, and you see it on every industrial world in the segmentum, and I had wound cable under that district for 18 years and knew he was right, so I stopped looking. They were pulled out on the 10th day by an order nobody in our sector had issued, and we never saw them again, and I assumed they had been shifted to a worse part of the line, and I was glad it was them and not us. Pelat lost his left hand to a piece of shrapnel from an Ork rocket in week 17. He wrapped the stump in a field dressing, picked up his last gun with his right hand, and went back to the firing step. And nobody said anything about it. By week 17, hands were optional equipment. Week 26 was the day the Orks brought something I had never seen before and hope never to see again. It came through the northern rubble field at dawn, hunched over and enormous, dragging a cannon behind it on a chain and surrounded by a mob of smaller greenskins who were hitting it with sticks and screaming at it. And it took me a moment to understand that the smaller Orks were not attacking the larger one. They were driving it, herding it forward the way you would herd livestock, except this livestock was the size of a chimera, and the cannon it was dragging was firing every time it took a step, seemingly at random, sending shells into our positions and into the Ork positions, and into empty rubble with complete impartiality. Prael called it a squigetath, which was apparently the guard term for it, and he said it like a man identifying a species of vermin he had hoped was extinct. It took Essex Chimera, all 4 of our remaining crack grenades, and a mining charge that Brond had been saving since week 8 to bring it down. And when it fell, it crushed 11 Orks beneath it, and its cannon fired one last time and put a shell through the 2nd floor of a building we had been using as a field hospital. 17 wounded men died in that blast. There was nobody left to say anything over them. The Corvinal Cathedral had come down in the 5th week, with most of its clergy inside it, and after that the ecclesiarchy on Threnhaven consisted of whatever any given man could remember, which in Prael's case was the short form of the committal because he had heard it enough times on 3 other worlds to reproduce it without understanding a word. He said it over the dead for about a month. Then he stopped, and when Kosim asked him why, Prael said that saying it properly took 90 seconds, and we were producing bodies faster than that. By week 28, the Orks were weakening. I do not mean they were retreating. Orks do not retreat in any way that word means when applied to human beings. I mean they were thinning. Fewer mobs each morning, smaller mobs. The vehicles came less often. The screaming, which had been a constant ambient sound for 7 months, a background noise so persistent that silence felt louder than artillery, began to develop gaps, pauses, Moments where you could hear wind moving through rubble without a greenskin voice underneath it. Prael noticed it first, because Prael noticed everything first, and he told us not to trust it, since a quiet orc is either dead or planning something, and planning something was worse. He was wrong about that. For once in his life, Gavin Prael was wrong. They were dying. The orc ecology on Threnhaven was collapsing, not through anything we did, but because the initial landing force had been a splinter, a fragment of a larger mass that had broken off and hit our world by accident, or by the crude gravitational logic that passes for orc navigation, and it was not large enough to sustain itself. They were running out of themselves. The attacks kept coming. An orc with a weapon and a target does not stop until one of those things is gone. But the attacks were smaller, and the orcs in them were thinner, and some of them were barely armed, and by the 30th week, Kosim said they looked hungry, which was a word I had not associated with greenskins before, and which I found more disturbing than anything they had done when they were at full strength. We broke them in the 31st week, not with a brilliant assault or a daring flanking action, or any of the things that make good stories. We broke them by walking forward. Prael gave the order at dawn, and we stood up out of the trenches we had held for 7 months and walked north across the Grenden highway and kept walking. And the orcs that came at us we killed, and the ones that ran we let run, and the ones that stood and screamed we killed too. And by midday we had crossed 6 kilometers of ground that had been orc territory for half a year, and found nothing in it except corpses in various stages of decomposition and crude structures made of wreckage and the thick, fungal stink of greenskin biology, doing whatever it does when the greenskins themselves are no longer around to tend it. We won by every measure that a soldier uses to determine the outcome of a battle. We won the siege of Threnhaven. The orc force was broken along the entire Grenden front, all 130 kilometers of it, 14 sectors pushing north simultaneously, the greenskins dying across the whole line, and the order to advance was the first order in 7 months that did not require anyone to stay in a hole and wait. The sector net said the total advance involved just under 19,000 soldiers, which was everything that remained of the 30,000 who had held the line at the start. In Sector 9, 840 of us had started the advance, and 719 of us were standing at the end of it. We had killed 300,000 greenskins in 7 months. That is not a number I can make meaningful. It belongs on a logistics report rather than in a sentence spoken out loud. But it is what we did with garrison troops and armed civilians and one chimera. We were alive and the enemy was not. And in any sane universe, that would have been the end of it. The relief fleet arrived 11 hours later. I watched it come in from the roof of a burnt-out textile mill on the northern edge of the highway, sitting on a pile of broken masonry, with a cup of recaf that Trake had brewed from a tin he had been saving for exactly this occasion. The fleet came in high, a string of lights above the cloud layer that resolved into ship signatures as they dropped into low orbit, and Trake stood up and pointed at them with the hand that was not holding his cup and said, "Emperor on the throne, would you look at that?" And I looked. 7 warships in formation, 3 bulk transports, 2 smaller escorts running the flanks, a fleet large enough to make me wonder, briefly, what they thought they were coming to fight, because the greenskin force was already broken, and what remained of it was scattered remnants that a single cruiser and a regiment could have swept in a week, and this was considerably more than that. Trake had been a tap-room hand in one of the Corvinal breweries before the draft, which accounted for the recaf, and for the fact that he had kept a tin of it through 7 months of siege for a day he was not certain would arrive. Brand started cheering. Others joined. Someone fired a last gun into the air, which Prial stopped immediately, not over the waste of ammunition, but because he said it was undignified. Kosim sat down against a wall and closed his eyes and did not say anything, and I understood that too. Sometimes relief is too large to fit through the part of your body that makes sounds. I sat on my rubble and drank my recaf and watched the fleet settle into orbit, and for a few minutes I allowed myself to think that the worst thing that was ever going to happen to me had already happened, and that everything from this point forward would be some version of ordinary. I was wrong about that, more wrong than I have ever been about anything, and the people who should be telling you why are all dead. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not our silence, theirs. The fleet had been in orbit for 4 hours and had not said a word. No hails on the general Vox frequency, no broadband announcements, no shuttle traffic, nothing. A fleet of that size, arriving at a world that had just endured a 7-month siege, and the first thing it did was sit in orbit like a row of closed doors and say absolutely nothing. Prial noticed, because Prial always noticed, and he said something about it to Vaincord over the command Vox, and Vaincord told him that fleet communications were being handled at command level and that ground units should stand by for further instructions. Prial turned off his Vox and looked at me and said he did not answer the question. I asked what the question had been. Prial said, I asked him why a relief fleet is not relieving. That was the last conversation I had before the shooting started. Not the Orc kind of shooting. The other kind, the kind that comes from above. The first lance strike hit the eastern edge of Corvinal, about 3 kilometers from our position, at 6 minutes past dawn. I know this. I was looking at the chrono when the building shook. A lance is not a shell. It does not arc. It does not whistle. It is a beam of focused energy traveling at the speed of light, which means you see the impact and hear the sound at the same time, which means there is no warning. 1 second, the eastern skyline of Corvinal was a row of damaged buildings with the sun coming up behind them. The next second, a column of white light punched through the cloud cover, and everything in a 300-meter radius of its impact point turned into superheated gas. The sound was not an explosion. It was a crack, like the world being broken across a knee. For approximately 2 seconds, I thought the fleet was shooting at an Orc position we had not cleared. This was reasonable. There were pockets of greenskins still scattered across the northern basin, and a fleet with orbital targeting would have better visibility than ground forces. For 2 seconds, that made sense. Then the second lance strike hit, 400 meters west of the first, and the third hit half a second after that, 600 meters south, and I understood with the slow, heavy clarity of a man watching a building fall that the strikes were not targeting Orc positions. They were walking across Corvinal in a grid pattern, east to west, clean, methodical, systematic. They were burning the city block by block with the precision of a man filling out a form. Brond was screaming. Several people were screaming. Prial was not screaming. Prial was standing at the edge of the rooftop, looking up at the sky like a man reading a column of figures that will not add, and then he turned around and said, "We need to move," in a tone that suggested he was recommending a change of venue at a social function rather than a response to orbital bombardment. I grabbed my pack and my lasgun and followed him down the stairwell, which was what I had been doing for 7 months, and I was not going to stop now. The Vox was chaos. Every surviving unit on the Grenden Line was trying to raise command. Some of them were reporting the lance strikes as enemy fire, which would have been funny if anything could have been funny at that moment. Others were asking for clarification. Others were just screaming into the Vox, wordless sounds of men watching the thing They had fought to save being cut apart from above. Vaincord's channel was dead. Clean silence, as though the man had turned off his equipment and walked away. Prael got us off the highway and into the Corvinal sub-industrial district, which was a maze of low fabrication buildings and storage yards that had taken relatively little damage during the siege, neither side having found any reason to fight over it. The lance strikes were still walking west, methodical, unhurried, each one erasing a city block with the impersonal efficiency of a clerk stamping a ledger. We moved south, away from the grid pattern, and for a while the strikes were behind us, visible as flashes reflected off the underside of the cloud cover, each flash accompanied by that cracking sound, that sound of something fundamental being separated into pieces that would never fit back together. There were civilians in the sub-industrial district. 40 million people had lived on Threnhaven before the Orks, and a significant number of them had survived the siege by doing what civilians do in a siege, which is go underground and stay quiet and hope that the people with guns resolve their differences before the food runs out. They came out when the Orks broke. They came out blinking and thin and filthy, and some of them were crying, and some of them were laughing, and some of them were just standing in the light looking at the sky like they had forgotten what it was. And now those same civilians were watching lance strikes walk across the city they had survived in, and the sounds coming out of them were worse than screaming. They had used up their fear days ago. We made it to a transit depot on the southern edge of the district, a big ferrocrete box, heavy-walled, the kind of building designed to survive industrial accidents rather than orbital bombardment, but better than standing in the open. There were other soldiers there, maybe 200, from a dozen different units, some of them provincial and some of them armed civilians, and a few 8th Veldrin survivors who had come through the siege in the same battered condition as the rest of us. Nobody was in command. Nobody was giving orders. Everyone was looking at each other with the expression of people who have all arrived at the same door at the same time, and none of them have a key. Prael took over. He did not ask permission. He did not announce himself. He walked to the center of the room and started talking, and people listened. His voice had the specific quality of a voice that has been giving orders under fire for 7 months and has had the uncertainty boiled out of it. He said, "The fleet is not here to help us. I do not know why. I do not know what their orders are. What I know is that they are putting lance strikes through a city full of Imperial citizens and Imperial soldiers, and they have not opened a single Vox channel to explain themselves, and that tells me everything I need to know about what they think we are." He said, "We have 2 options. We can stay here and hope they stop, or we can move and try to find out what is happening and whether there is a way off this world that does not involve being underneath an orbital weapon when it fires." He said, "I am going to move. You can come with me or you can stay. I will not think less of you either way. I do not have room to think about anything except walking." About 160 of us went with him. The rest stayed. I do not know what happened to the ones who stayed, I can guess. The lance strikes were still coming, 3 or 4 per minute now, the grid expanding outward from the city center toward the industrial ring, and if the pattern held, the transit depot was about 2 hours from being inside the target zone. Whether they moved before then, I do not know. We headed south toward the Corvinal starport. This was not a brilliant tactical decision. It was the only decision. If there were shuttles, they would be at the starport. If there were answers, they would be where the shuttles were. And if there were neither shuttles nor answers, at least the starport was 12 kilometers from the current bombardment pattern, and 12 kilometers of distance felt like a fortune to men who had spent 7 months fighting over meters. The march south took us through the civilian districts, and it is the part of this story I think about most often. The civilians had come out of their shelters and their basements and their hiding places during the night when the siege broke, and now they were in the streets. Tens of thousands of them, maybe more. They were not panicking, and that was the thing I could not get past. They were moving, not running. Moving, south the same as us, in a current that filled the roads and the alleyways and the gaps between buildings, carrying whatever they could hold in their hands, and the sound of it was not shouting or weeping, but the low, sustained murmur of a very large number of people doing something together without any coordination, like water finding a channel. Children were in that current. Old people, people carrying other people. A woman walked past me holding a ceramic jar against her chest with both arms, and I will never know what was in that jar. But I know that she had decided it was worth carrying 12 kilometers under orbital bombardment, and there was something about the way she held it that made me look away because it was a private thing and I had no right to it. The strikes were still coming. Behind us now, mostly, but the pattern was expanding, and occasionally a lance would reach out ahead of the grid line, 2 or 3 kilometers in front of the main bombardment, hitting something specific. A bridge, a Vox relay tower, a water processing facility. These were not random. Someone up there was reading a map and removing infrastructure the way a surgeon removes tissue around a wound, cutting the connections that held the city together, so that when the main bombardment reached each district, it was already isolated, already dark, already cut off from water, power, communication. The city was being killed before it was being burned. 4 of those early strikes did not fit that pattern, and I did not understand them then. They went into the sub-level access heads in the Corvinal South Industrial District. Not the buildings above them. The heads themselves, the shafts, straight down. The same 4 points hit again 40 minutes later, and a third time before the main grid had moved a kilometer. There is no infrastructure argument for it. Cutting a district off does not require you to put a lance down a stairwell 3 times before you have burned anything above it. I had wound cable under that district for 18 years, and I knew what was down those shafts, which was pumping stations and cable runs and 16,000 people who worked a shift rotation, and I stood there in the middle of an orbital bombardment and thought that somebody in that fleet was wasting ordnance on holes in the ground. We were 3 kilometers from the starport when the first drop pod hit. Not an Ork drop pod, an Imperial one. It came down in the middle of a residential block about 500 meters to our east, kicking up a column of debris and dust. And before the dust settled, the ramp was down and soldiers were coming out of it. Soldiers in proper equipment, clean equipment, carapace armor, hell guns, unit markings I did not recognize. They formed up in a perimeter around the pod, fast and professional, and then they started moving into the residential block, and I heard shooting. Not a firefight, shooting. One-sided, sustained, the sound of weapons being discharged into things that were not shooting back. Imperial stopped the column. He got on the Vox, cycling through frequencies, trying to raise anyone, trying to find a channel that would tell him what those soldiers were doing in that residential block, and why the sounds coming out of it were the sounds they were. He found a frequency. It was not a command channel. It was a general broadcast, automated, repeating on a loop, and what it said was this: all planetary defense forces and irregular militia units are to report immediately to designated processing points for administrative reassignment. Failure to report within 6 standard hours will be classified as desertion. The Emperor protects. Prale listened to it twice. Then he turned it off and looked at me and said, processing. I have been in the Guard for 16 years, and I have never heard that word used for anything good. We did not go to the starport. Priel turned us west, away from the drop pods, away from the starport, away from the clean soldiers with their hell guns and their one-sided shooting and their administrative reassignment. We went into the Corvinal Western Industrial Belt, which was a kilometers-deep band of manufactories and processing plants and storage facilities that wrapped around the city like a second wall, and which had the one quality we needed more than any other: density, cover, places to hide, places where 160 people carrying small arms could disappear into the infrastructure and become very difficult to find. Because whatever was happening in Corvinal, whatever the fleet was doing, and whatever those soldiers had been doing in that residential block, we were not going to walk into a processing point and find out what processing meant. That night, we sheltered in a turbine assembly plant on the western fringe. Big building, heavy walls, multiple exits, poor sight lines from above. Priel posted sentries and let the rest of us sleep, or try to sleep, which is a generous description of what 160 people did that night on the floor of a factory while their city burned behind them and the sky pulsed white every 30 seconds with another lance strike. I lay on the ferrocrete floor with my pack under my head and my las gun across my chest, and I listened to the bombardment walk closer, strike by strike, each impact a little louder than the last, and I tried to calculate how long it would take the grid pattern to reach our position and whether we would need to move before dawn. Kosim came over and sat next to me and did not say anything for a long time. Then, "Did you hear the broadcast?" I had. "What do you think processing means?" I did not know and was not interested in finding out from the inside. He said, "The fleet was supposed to be a relief fleet." That was the word Vencord used. Relief. I remembered. And now they are burning the city we held for them for 7 months. I said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that I had not already thought. "I was a teacher before the draft," he said. "Did I ever tell you that?" He had not. Secondary school, mathematics, 14 years of it. And then the lottery, and then the 4th provincial, and then the line, and now this. And none of the mathematics I ever learned has a formula for what happens when you win a war and your own side kills you for it. He turned his cup around on the floor a few times. Then the supply drops. The shuttles. I ran the numbers once, you know. Transit time, fuel load, turnaround cycle. I asked what he had found. He said, the shuttles were coming from too close. The nearest subsector depot is 47 days out by standard transport. Those shuttles were running on a 9-day cycle with loaded cargo. They were not coming from any depot I could find on the charts. I asked him why he had not said anything. He said, because I did not have a better explanation, and a man who asks questions about the ammunition supply while the ammunition is still arriving is a man who deserves whatever answer he gets. He was quiet after that. So was I. Above us, through the heavy walls, through the ceiling, through everything, the lance strikes went on. Rhythmic, patient, not stopping, not slowing. The fleet had come to burn Threnhaven, and it was going to burn all of it. Every block, every district, every square meter of the world we had spent 7 months dying to keep. And it had all the time and all the ammunition, and owed no explanation to anything it was destroying. That was the first night. We moved at dawn, not because dawn was tactically superior to any other time, but because the lance strikes paused for about 40 minutes around first light each morning, and we learned very quickly that those 40 minutes were the closest thing to safety Threnhaven had left. The pause was not mercy, it was cooling time. The lance batteries on a warship generate heat that has to be vented between firing cycles, and the fleet was running its weapons at a sustained rate that required periodic shutdown. The shutdown fell at local dawn. They had synchronized the schedule to the planetary rotation. I learned this later. At the time, I did not know why the strikes paused, and I did not care. I cared about 40 minutes of quiet and what we could do with them. We had 163 people when we left the turbine plant. 4th Provincial, 8th Veldrin, armed civilians, and a handful of provincial logistics personnel who had survived the siege by running supply depots and who were now discovering that the skills required to survive a bombardment by your own navy are somewhat different from the skills required to manage an inventory. Prael organized us into 4 groups of roughly 40, each with a designated route through the industrial belt, each with a rally point 4 kilometers south, and each with standing orders that were very simple. If you see greenskins, kill them. If you see Imperial ground forces, do not let them see you. If you reach the rally point and nobody else is there, wait 2 hours and then move south. Do not go to a processing point. Do not answer a Vox hail. Do not trust anyone whose boots are clean. My group went through the sealant works, which was a sprawl of chemical storage tanks and processing sheds that covered about 4 city blocks and smelled like something that had died inside a barrel of industrial adhesive. Threnhaven had manufactured sealant for off-world export, 17 different grades of it, and the storage facility held it in tall cylindrical tanks that stood in rows like metal trees, connected by catwalks and laddered maintenance gantries, and the whole place had the dense, cluttered geometry that ground-level infantry loves and aerial observation hates. We moved through it carefully, checking angles, watching the sky, listening for the particular sound that orc movement makes, which is not footsteps, so much as the sustained background noise of several hundred kilograms of angry muscle failing to move quietly. We found them in the 3rd tank row, a mob of about 30 greenskins huddled in the space between 2 storage tanks, and they were doing something I had never seen orcs do before. They were hiding. Not ambushing, not waiting. Hiding. Pressed into the shadow of the tanks with their weapons clutched against their bodies and their heads down, and the biggest one among them, a knob roughly 7 feet tall with a jaw like a cargo clamp, was looking up at the sky with an expression that I would have called fear if I had ever believed an orc could feel such a thing. The lance strikes had done something to them. The bombardment was not discriminating between human targets and orc targets, because the bombardment was not discriminating at all. It was burning everything, and the orcs who would charge into massed gunfire without hesitation, who would throw themselves at fortified positions for the pure savage joy of it, were afraid of the sky. They had found an enemy they could not hit, and it had broken something in them that I had not known could break. We could have gone around them. The tank rows extended for 300 meters in either direction, and the orcs had not seen us. Prael looked at them for about 5 seconds, calculating, and then he gave the hand signal for line assault, which was the signal I had learned in the 4th week of the siege, and which meant spread out, pick targets, and fire on his mark. I do not know why he did it. 7 months of killing greenskins had become load-bearing structure in him. We lined up along the catwalk on the eastern side of the tank row and opened fire, and the orcs died where they sat, most of them, the big knob taking 4 last bolts before it got to its feet, and 3 more before it fell, and the ones that managed to stand and charge reached about halfway to our position before the concentrated fire cut them down. The whole thing took about 90 seconds. Nobody in our group was hit. Nobody was injured. It was the cleanest engagement we had fought in 7 months, and it felt worse than any of the nightmares on the Grenden Line. Those orcs had been crouching in the dark like animals hiding from a storm. We were doing the fleet's work for it. We cleared the sealant works and made it to the rally point by mid-morning. 2 of Priel's 4 groups made it. The third arrived 90 minutes late with 5 fewer people than it had started with. The 4th never arrived. Kosim was in the 4th group, and Pellet was with him. One-handed Pellet, who had been firing a last gun from week 17 without complaint. And neither of them came back. And nobody from that group came back, and I never found out whether they were killed by Orks, or by the fleet, or by the simple mathematics of a 40-minute window that was not long enough. Kosim had done the arithmetic that would have told us everything, and it went with him. Prael took a head count, 121, down from 163 in less than half a day, and we had fired our weapons exactly once. The attrition had nothing to do with combat. It was from people deciding, individually, quietly, to stop walking, to sit down against a wall or a tank or a pile of rubble and not get up. Some of them went to find processing points because the broadcast was still running, and a man who is tired enough and frightened enough will believe anything that promises him a procedure to follow. Others just stopped. A man who sits down and does not get up has made a decision that requires nothing from anybody else, and I could feel that one pressing on the edges of my own thinking. We learned what processing meant that afternoon, and the lesson came secondhand. A woman named Drenhall found us in the ruins of a distribution warehouse about 6 kilometers south of the rally point. She was a provincial defense logistics officer, middle-aged, heavy-set, with the particular complexion of a person who has been running for 12 hours without water. She introduced herself by rank and depot designation before she gave her name. She had been at the starport when the fleet's ground troops arrived. She had seen the processing. The word she used was triage. The ground forces had set up assessment stations at the starport landing pads, and they were running everyone through them, military and civilian alike, in orderly queues that moved at a pace designed to process a large number of people without creating bottlenecks. Each person was assessed: skills, physical condition, age, occupational history, and a set of questions about family that Drenhall said made no sense to her at the time, and that she repeated to us twice, slowly, as though saying them again might make them mean something. How many generations your line had been on Threnhaven, which sub-level your grandparents worked, whether you had brothers. The ones who had something the Imperium considered worth transporting were loaded onto shuttles. Skilled workers, certain technical specialists, children under a certain age, healthy adults who met unspecified criteria that Drenhall had not been able to determine from her position in the queue. These people were put on shuttles and taken up to the transport ships, and Drenhall assumed, probably correctly, that they would be resettled somewhere on some other world that needed bodies, because the Imperium does not waste useful resources even when it is in the process of destroying the place those resources came from. Everyone else was put against a wall. Drenhall said that sentence the way you say a sentence when you have already said it to yourself 100 times and the words have stopped meaning anything. Everyone else was put against a wall. She said it, and then she stopped talking and looked at the floor of the warehouse, and Priel did not ask her to continue because Priel knew what being put against a wall meant in the same way every soldier in the Imperium knows what it means. And it meant exactly and only what it sounds like it means. The fleet was salvaging human assets and disposing of the remainder. I understood it that day as arithmetic. Somebody on one of those ships had costed 40 million lives against the available hulls and decided which of them were worth the fuel, and had authorized the disposal of the surplus the way a man scraps machine parts. That is what I told the others, and that is what I believed for a long time afterwards. And it was the wrong question. Nobody was weighing us against the cost of a birth. Drenhall had gotten out of the queue because she was a logistics officer and had recognized the sorting pattern for what it was before she reached the assessment point. She had walked out the side of the queue and nobody stopped her, since the queue was designed for compliance and she was the wrong shape for the hole. She had been walking south since then and had not stopped. We took her with us. She knew supply routes and depot locations, and more importantly, she knew the ground between us and the southern continent, which was the only part of Threnhaven the bombardment had not yet reached. Priel asked how long she thought we had before the grid pattern extended that far. Based on the rate of advance, about 4 days, maybe 5 if they pause for assessment. He asked what assessment meant in this context. The fleet sends down survey teams to verify that the bombardment has achieved its objectives before moving the grid forward. He asked what the objectives were. Drenhall looked at him. Nothing alive. We moved south, through the industrial belt, through the outer suburban ring, through the agricultural buffer zone that separated Corvinal proper from the scrub country to the south. The bombardment was behind us, but it was getting closer every hour, and ahead of us the Imperial ground forces were establishing a perimeter, landing troops at regular intervals along the southern boundary of the bombardment zone. And those troops were not there to rescue survivors. They were there to ensure that nothing escaped the grid. We were being herded. Not actively, not by anyone who knew we specifically existed, but systemically, the way a net works. The bombardment pushed everything south. The ground forces caught everything the bombardment missed, and the processing points sorted what was caught into 2 piles, useful and surplus, and the surplus was disposed of. I thought about that word a great deal over the next 2 days. Surplus. It is a manufacturing term. I knew it from the cable works, where surplus stock was stock that exceeded the current order book and was either stored at cost or scrapped. The fleet was applying the same logic to human beings. We lost Essek on the 2nd day. Not to the fleet, not to the Orks, to a building. We were moving through a residential area on the southern fringe of the outer suburbs, and a structure that had taken a near miss from a land strike in the first bombardment pass gave way as we were passing it, and Essek was underneath the section that fell. It took 6 of us 20 minutes to move enough rubble to reach him, and when we did, his legs were crushed from the knee down, and he was conscious and looking at us like a man partway through a sum he did not want to finish. Priel looked at the damage and said nothing, and Essek looked at Priel and said, "Just give me a charge pack and a wall to lean against, and point me at whatever comes through next." Priel gave him 3 charge packs and a canteen of water and left Brand's combat knife within reach, and we moved on. And I did not look back. Looking back was not going to change the arithmetic that Essek had already completed in his head. Brand lasted 1 more day after that. He went out on a forward scout with 3 others and walked into an Imperial patrol. Not a processing team, a combat patrol, light infantry in carapace armor, the kind of unit you deploy when your perimeter has gaps and you want to find out what is moving through them. Brand saw them first, from a factory loading dock about 200 meters out, and he did what any veteran of the Grenden Line would have done on instinct, which was go low and quiet and let them pass. But the patrol had auspex, proper handheld auspex that could read body heat through light cover, and they turned toward the loading dock, and one of them called out a challenge code that Brand did not have a response to because the code was fleet-issued, and nobody on the ground had been given it. Brand and his scouts killed 2 of the patrol before the rest of them dropped back and called in support. The support came in the form of a Valkyrie that appeared over the roof line in under 3 minutes, banking hard, its multi-laser already tracking, and it put a sustained burst through the building Brand was using as cover. The ferrocarrite walls held for about 4 seconds, and then they did not. One of the scouts made it back to us through a drainage culvert. Brand did not. The scout said Brand had been alive when the building came down, but that he had not come out, and that the patrol had gone in after him, and that what they were doing when they went in was not rescue. The scout also said the patrol had been wearing Threnhaven's own provincial defense shoulder patches under their carapace, which meant they were either wearing salvage or the Imperium had recruited some of our own people into the cleanup. And I did not know which of those possibilities was worse. By the end of the 3rd day, we were down to 94 people. We were south of the outer suburbs, in the scrub country, moving through terrain that was open enough to make us nervous and broken enough to give us intermittent cover. The bombardment was 12 kilometers behind us and closing. The ground force perimeter was somewhere ahead of us, distance unknown, and between us and them was Ork country, because the greenskin remnants had been pushed south by the bombardment the same way we had, and the ones who had survived the land strikes were not hiding anymore. They were fighting everything, fighting each other, fighting us, fighting the landscape itself, tearing at the ground and the rubble and the air with the blind, directionless fury of animals that have been hurt by something they cannot see and have decided to hurt everything they can. We hit a mob of 200 or 300 of them in a ravine about 8 kilometers south of the suburban ring. They were not organized. They were not coherent. They were just orcs. A mass of green muscle and crude weapons streaming through the ravine heading south at speed, not looking for a fight, but ready for one in the way that orcs are always ready for one, which is to say, instantly. Imperial put us on the ridge line above the ravine, and we poured fire into them for about 4 minutes, which is a very long time when you are shooting as fast as your last gun will cycle, and they came apart under it, but not before a dozen of them made it up the slope and into our line. And then it was close work, bayonets and rifle butts and boots and teeth, and the raw animal process of killing something that is trying very hard to kill you. I killed 3 of them in that ravine. The first one I shot through the throat at a range of about 2 meters, which was close enough to see the last bolt hit and close enough to feel the heat of the wound on my face. The second one I bayoneted in the gut, which does not kill an orc the way it kills a man, so I had to twist the blade and pull it sideways, and then shoot it twice more while it was trying to pull the bayonet out of itself, and the whole exchange took about 4 seconds and felt like 40. The third one I killed with bronze combat knife, which I had taken from Essex's position before we left because Essex was not going to need 2 weapons, and I had a feeling I might need a spare, and the feeling was correct because the orc knocked my last gun out of my hands and I was on the ground underneath it with its hands around my throat, and the knife went into the side of its neck and I pushed it sideways and something hot came out of the wound that was not blood in any color I associated with blood, and the orc's grip loosened and it fell on top of me, and I lay there under 400 pounds of dead greenskin for about 30 seconds before Trake pulled it off me. We lost 11 people in that engagement, 7 dead, 4 wounded badly enough that they could not walk. Imperial left the 4 wounded with weapons and water and a direction to crawl toward, which was west, away from both the bombardment and the orc migration route, and whether any of them made it anywhere I do not know. I stopped keeping track of the people we left behind. The 4th day, 83 people, moving south through increasingly open terrain, the bombardment 10 kilometers behind and gaining, the ground shaking every 30 seconds with another strike. Imperial was on the Vox constantly now, scanning frequencies, listening for anything that was not the processing broadcast, which was still running on loop, still telling us to report for administrative reassignment, in a voice that did not know or did not care that the administrative reassignment involved a wall. He found something that afternoon, a signal. Faint, encrypted, running on a frequency that was not standard military and not standard civilian. And Prael recognized it because Prael recognized everything. And he said it was a command-tier burst signal, the kind used for intership communication within a fleet formation. The signal was coming from the ground. Prael looked at it for a long time. He looked at the direction finder. He looked at the terrain ahead of us. Then he looked at me and said, "That is a fleet signal on a ground transmitter, and there is only one person on this planet who would have fleet communications equipment." I said, "Vein cord." Prael said, "Vein cord." And then he said, "I have a great many questions for Colonel Vein cord, and I am going to ask them with my rifle at his head, because I have been a soldier for 16 years, and I have never been lied to this thoroughly by someone who was supposed to be on my side, and I would like to understand the technical details of how it was accomplished." We turned east toward the signal, and we walked for 6 hours through scrub country that was on fire in places where the bombardment had overshot its grid, and through ground that was littered with dead orcs who had been caught in the open by lance strikes, their bodies split and fused into the soil by thermal energy that had turned the topsoil to glass around them, and the craters they lay in were smooth and concave and reflected the sky like bowls of dirty water. We found the signal source at dusk on the 4th day, in a place that had no business existing. It was a command bunker, military grade, buried under a low ridge about 9 kilometers east of our previous heading and 2 kilometers south of the bombardment line. Ferrocrete walls, filtered air supply, reinforced blast doors, Vox arrays on the roof that were very clearly not standard provincial equipment. This was not a field position. This was not something thrown together during the siege. The bunker had been built before the Orks came. The ferrocrete was cured and settled, the door mechanisms oiled and maintained, the power supply humming with the steady note of a generator that has been running for months. Someone had put this here on purpose, in advance, and equipped it for exactly the situation we were now in. There were soldiers outside, 4 of them in uniforms I did not recognize. Clean uniforms, carapace armor, sidearms, and the particular posture of men who have been standing guard over something they consider important in a place they consider safe. They saw us coming because we were not trying to hide. 83 people in ragged kit do not sneak up on anything. One of them raised a hand, palm out, the universal gesture for stop, and Prael walked straight past the hand and through the blast door as though the man attached to it was a piece of furniture he had decided not to sit on. I followed Prael because I always followed Prael, and Trake followed me, as he had since week 12 of the siege for reasons neither of us had ever discussed, and behind us about 40 others came through the door because the guards had made the sensible decision that 4 sidearms versus 40 lasguns is not a ratio worth dying for. The rest of our people stayed outside, and I heard Drenhall talking to the guards in a calm, professional tone that suggested she was either negotiating or making a threat, and with Drenhall it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. The interior of the bunker was exactly what I expected and nothing like what I wanted. A command center, Vox equipment 3 full arrays, each one tuned to a different fleet frequency, and each one actively broadcasting. A hololithic display table showing the Corvinal Basin from above, with the bombardment grid laid over it in clean blue lines. The completed zones marked in red, and the active zones pulsing in white, and the whole thing updated in real time so that whoever was sitting in this room could watch the destruction of Threnhaven as a progress report on a manufacturing order. Status indicators for the fleet, ammunition counts, firing schedules, cooling intervals. The whole apparatus of planetary destruction laid out in the language of logistics and production targets. Colonel Mountain Vaincord was sitting at the display table when we came in. He looked up at us with the expression of a man whose meeting has been interrupted by people who are not on the agenda. And then he looked at Prael, and his face did something complicated that I have spent a long time trying to describe and have never managed to do in fewer than 3 words. His face held neither surprise nor fear. He was, I think, resigned. The particular resignation of a man who has known for a long time that a specific moment was coming and has been carrying the weight of it and has now set it down. He said, "Sergeant Prael, I expected you to come north," and his voice was flat, conversational, as though we had arrived for a scheduled appointment. Prael had his last gun up, not aimed at Vaincord precisely, but held at a height and an angle that made the trajectory clear. He said, "Colonel, I am going to ask you a series of questions, and you are going to answer them, and I am going to know if you are lying because I have been lied to by better men than you, and I have developed an ear for it." Vaincord nodded. He did not stand. He did not reach for a weapon. He sat there at his display table with the blue grid of Threnhaven's destruction glowing on his face, and he waited. Prael said, "When did you know?" Vaincord said, "When did I know what? Do not do that. When did you know the fleet was coming to burn the world?" "Before I arrived," Vaincord said. "It was the mission briefing. I was sent here 14 weeks into the siege specifically to coordinate ground conditions with the fleet's operational timeline." Prael said, "Coordinate ground conditions." Vaincord said, "Yes." He put a great deal into that one syllable, more than it was built to carry. Prael said, "Explain." Vaincord looked at the display table and then back at Prael and said, "I will tell you whatever you want to know, but I need your people on that ridge with their weapons facing outward for the next 4 hours, because the bombardment grid reaches this position at approximately 0200, and I need to be airborne before that, and right now your 83 guns are the only thing between me and every surviving greenskin that the grid is pushing south." He put it as a business arrangement, and Prael stared at him for a long time and then said, "Talk." The fleet was not a relief fleet. It had never been a relief fleet. It was a sterilization group assembled at the Veldren subsector naval base over a period of 11 months for the specific purpose of destroying Threnhaven and everything on it. Vaincord said his commission was God on paper and had been seconded before he ever saw Threnhaven to an authority he named once and did not name again. And Prael's face changed when he heard it in a way that told me the name meant something to a man who had served on 3 worlds, and nothing at all to a man who had wound cable. The Ork incursion was the trigger, but not the cause. When the Hulk fragment hit and the greenskins started landing, Segmentum Command made a calculation, and the calculation was this. Threnhaven's strategic position placed it between 2 systems of significantly greater value. An Ork force that established itself on Threnhaven would use it as a staging point for further expansion, and the next targets would be Forge World Hessenmark to the galactic east and the Veldren naval base itself to the south. The cost of allowing Ork expansion into either of those systems was, by Segmentum Command's assessment, catastrophic and unacceptable. The cost of destroying Threnhaven was, by the same assessment, manageable and within tolerance. But the Orks had to be on Threnhaven when the fleet arrived. If they scattered, if they broke out, if they launched from the surface before the sterilization group was in position, then the entire calculation failed, and the fleet would be chasing Ork splinters across 3 systems instead of burning them in 1. And even if the greenskins were killed to the last, Vaincord said, the world was already lost. He used a term I had not heard before, spore saturation. He said that orc biology seeds the ground with fungal matter that survives independently of the orcs themselves, and that once a sufficient quantity has entered the soil and the water and the root systems of whatever grows there, the contamination is permanent. New greenskins would grow from the earth itself, year after year, generation after generation, until the biosphere was more orc than human. 7 months of orc presence had put Threnhaven past that threshold. Even if we had killed every greenskin on the surface, the ground itself was an enemy we could not fight. The only sterilization that reaches fungal contamination at root depth is thermal. The defense of Threnhaven was not an act of salvation, it was containment. We were the walls of the cage, and the orcs were what was caged, and the cage existed so that the fleet could burn it with everything inside. Vaincord said this calmly. He said it the way a man recites a technical specification without inflection. He said, "My job was to ensure that the orc force remained engaged on Threnhaven until the fleet was assembled and in position. This meant maintaining a credible defense. It meant keeping the orcs interested. It meant ensuring that the provincial and militia forces on the Grenden Line continued to fight, because a defensive line that fights is a line that draws orcs toward it, and orcs that are drawn toward a fight do not leave to find another one." He said, "Every tactical recommendation I made was designed to keep the greenskins concentrated in the Corvinal Basin. The rotation schedules, the supply drops, the defensive positions, all of it was calibrated to maintain contact without winning decisively, because a decisive victory would break the orc force and scatter the survivors, and scattered survivors cannot be sterilized in a single operation." I said, "The sortie." Week 18, Prael wanted to break the column and scatter them into the northern districts. Vaincord looked at me and said, "Yes, that sortie would have worked. It would have dispersed them across 300 square kilometers, and the fleet would have spent months chasing fragments instead of burning them in a single grid. I could not allow that." Prael said nothing for about 15 seconds, which was the longest I had ever seen Prael go without responding to something. Then he said, 11 months. You said the group was assembled over 11 months. The greenskins have been on this world for 7. Vaincord did not answer that. Prael said it again, slower, the way he said things to men who had heard him the first time. 11 months of assembly for an incursion that is 7 months old. Who ordered a sterilization group for a world that had nothing wrong with it? Vaincord said, "That is above my clearance, and it was above it when I took the briefing. I was given a schedule and a task and a date the schedule began, and I did not ask what generated the date, and I have found that a great deal of my working life goes more smoothly when I do not." Prael let it go. He expected to have time. Then he said, "The supply drops, the shuttles. They came from the fleet." Vaincord said, "From the fleet's forward logistics element. The fleet has been in the outer system for 11 weeks, assembling. The supply shuttles were running from a transport in the Oort cloud. They were not coming from anywhere that was trying to save you. They were coming from the same people who were preparing to kill you, and they were keeping you alive because a dead defensive line does not hold orcs in place." Kosim had been right about the numbers, I thought. 9 days was too fast for a subsector depot. The shuttles had been coming from the Oort cloud, which was about 8 days out, and a mathematics teacher on the Grenden Line had worked that out on his own, and then died before he could tell anyone who mattered. We had prayed for those supply shuttles. We had rationed the ammunition they brought, and divided the rations they carried, and treated the medical supplies they contained as something close to sacred, because those shuttles were the proof that someone out there knew we existed and cared whether we lived or died. Every crate that opened was a covenant. Someone out there is coming. Hold the line. And now a man at a desk was telling us the shuttles were feed, and we were livestock kept alive to stand in front of Orks and bleed until the fleet was ready to burn us with them. I had wondered, when the fleet arrived, why it was so large. 7 warships for a splinter force we had already broken, with last guns and 1 chimera. You do not send a cruiser and a regiment to sterilize a planet. The fleet had always been sized for the job it came to do. Preil looked at Vaincord for a long time. Then he said, "The people in this room who are not you have about 6 hours before the bombardment grid reaches this position. You have a shuttle. You were always going to leave before the grid reached here." Vaincord said yes. "How many does the shuttle hold?" 12. "There are 83 of us outside." "I know." There was a silence. In the silence, I could hear the bombardment, distant, rhythmic, each strike a dull concussion that traveled through the ground and up through the ferrocrete floor and into my feet. The display table showed the grid advancing, clean blue lines turning red, 1 row at a time, each row a kilometer of ground that had been Threnhaven and was now nothing. The rate of advance had not changed. The fleet was not hurrying. It was not slowing. It was proceeding at the pace established in the operational timeline, written by someone who had never set foot on the world it described. Preil said, "Then we take the shuttle, and we take you, and we take whoever fits, and the rest walk south and try to outrun the grid." Vaincord said, "The grid extends to the southern continent. There is nowhere south that is outside the sterilization zone. The entire planet is scheduled." Preil put the muzzle up then, properly up, and said, 40 million people. You have a problem in the Corvinal Basin, and you are burning a world 1,800 kilometers wide. Cordon it. Lift the population off the southern continent and burn the north. That is a fortnight's work for a fleet that size, and every officer in this room knows it. Why all of them? Vaincord said he could not answer that and would give him the next best thing. And then he recited, flatly, the way a man recites something he has been made to memorize, the assessment criteria issued to the processing points. Generations resident, sub-level of origin for both grandparents, siblings living and dead, whether the subject had been born on Threnhaven or had come in. I had heard 3 of those 4 before, in a distribution warehouse 6 kilometers south of a rally point, from a logistics officer who had stood in the queue at the starport and repeated them to us twice because they had made no sense to her. They made no more sense in a colonel's mouth. He said those were the questions in that order, and that he had been given them without an explanation and had not requested one, and that the transport allocation had been calculated before the criteria were issued, which told him the number they expected to keep before anyone had been asked anything. He said, "I do not know what they are looking for. I know they are not looking for it in one district." Preil did not say anything to that. He had been a soldier for 16 years on 3 worlds, and I had wound cable for 18, and I watched him work out what those 4 questions meant, and then decide not to say it out loud in a room with 40 of his own men in it. He lowered the rifle. That was the only answer I ever got. I do not know what Preil would have done next because he did not get to do it. The Orks arrived, and they arrived in a way that made every engagement on the Grenden Line look like a skirmish. Not a mob, not a column, a migration. The bombardment had been pushing every surviving greenskin south for 4 days, the same way it had been pushing us. And the Ork remnants had been consolidating as they moved, the way Orks always consolidate. The big ones absorbing the small ones, and the small ones following the big ones, since Ork hierarchy is gravity, and mass attracts mass. The result was a force of several thousand greenskins moving through the scrub country at speed, driven by the bombardment behind them and drawn by the signal arrays on the bunker roof. Orcs hear electronics the way dogs hear frequencies outside human range, and 3 active Vox arrays broadcasting on fleet frequencies were producing exactly the kind of noise that Orc biology interprets as a target. The first rounds hit the bunker roof, and the signal arrays went down, and Vancord's face changed in a way that told me the arrays were the only part of this situation he actually cared about. The guards outside started firing. Our people started firing. The Orcs came up the ridge in a wave that was not organized in any tactical sense, but was organized in the sense that water is organized when it finds a slope, all of it going the same direction for the same reason, which was down and forward and into whatever was in front of it. The fight at the bunker lasted about 20 minutes. I know roughly how long because the bombardment kept its schedule through all of it, strike after strike walking closer, and the last one shook ferrocrete dust out of the ceiling onto the display table. We killed Orcs. A lot of Orcs. The ridge gave us elevation and the bunker gave us a position, and the surviving provincial and militia soldiers on that ridge had 7 months of practice killing greenskins, and they had a great deal of unprocessed emotion about being caged and lied to and sentenced to death by their own fleet, and they poured all of it into their weapons. But there were a lot of Orcs, and some of them got up the ridge. The first 3 came over the lip together, 2 boys and a larger one with a metal plate bolted directly to its skull. And Trake killed the first with a shot through the open mouth, and I killed the second with the bayonet, because my charge pack was cycling, and the one with the plate took a hit from Drenhall's last pistol in the shoulder and barely noticed and kept coming until 4 people fired into it simultaneously, and it went down in a heap that slid back down the slope and took 2 more climbing Orcs with it. After that, they came in 1s and 2s, the slope too steep and the fire too heavy for a massed rush, and we killed them as they crested one after another. A methodical butcher's work that went on for minutes that felt like hours, the ridgeline becoming a barrier of green corpses that the next wave had to climb over before it could reach us. And still they kept coming because Orcs do not stop, because stopping is not in them, because whatever furnace drives their biology runs on violence and does not have an off switch. Then one of them came up that was bigger than the rest, the biggest greenskin I had seen since the siege. A war boss, or close to it, 8 feet of scarred green muscle, carrying a crude power claw that sparked and crackled with stolen energy, and it came over the ridgeline at a point about 6 meters from where Prael was standing and directing fire. And Prael turned and put 3 shots into its chest, and the Orc barely slowed. It hit him with the power claw, and Prael went sideways and down, and did not get up. And I shot the Orc 4 times in the head from a distance of about 3 meters, and the 4th shot found something vital, and it dropped. I went to Prael. He was on his back, looking up at the sky, and the left side of his torso was wrong in a way that I am not going to describe, except to say that the power claw had done what power claws do, and it had done it thoroughly. He was alive. He looked at me, and his mouth moved, and I leaned in, and he said, "The shuttle. 12 seats. Do the arithmetic, Velke." He said it the way he said everything, like a practical instruction, and then his eyes moved to something I could not see, and he stopped talking, and he stopped breathing, and Gavin Prael, who had kept me alive for 7 months, through sheer competence and stubbornness and an unwillingness to die that bordered on professional negligence, was dead on the floor of a bunker that should not have existed, on a world being destroyed by the people he had served his whole adult life. The Orcs broke after the war boss fell. That is what orcs do. The gravity source collapses and the smaller masses scatter, and the survivors ran back down the ridge and into the scrub country, and we let them go, having neither the ammunition nor the will to chase them. 12 of us were dead on that slope. Vaincord had asked for 4 hours of guns facing outward, and he had got them at the price he had known the whole time they would cost, and he had not stood up from his chair once during any of it. I stood up. I looked at Vaincord. He was still sitting at his display table, which was dark now because the signal arrays were down and the hololithic had lost its feed. He looked smaller without the glow of Threnhaven's destruction on his face. I said, "The shuttle, where is it?" And my voice did not sound like my voice. It sounded like Prael's. Vaincord said, "The landing pad is 200 meters east below the ridge. It is fueled and prepped. The flight plan is loaded. It will take you to the fleet's rear logistics element, which is where I was going." I said, 12 seats. He said, 12 seats. I said, "There are 71 of us alive out there, and you are telling me 12 seats." He said, "I am telling you what the shuttle holds. What you do with that information is not my problem." I hit him. I am not proud of it, and I am not ashamed of it. I hit him in the face with my closed fist, and he fell sideways off his chair and lay on the floor of his bunker, and I stood over him, and I wanted very badly to kill him, and I did not. Not because killing him would have been wrong, but because killing him would have used up time that 12 people did not have. Drake helped me pick the 12. Not because he had better judgment than I did, but because I could not do it alone, and he was the only person left from the original squad, and that meant something, even if it was nothing more than shared history. We stood at the bunker entrance and looked at 71 people sitting on a ridge in the dark, exhausted, wounded, filthy, waiting. They knew about the shuttle. Sound carries in a bunker, and the conversation with Vaincord had not been quiet. They knew there were 12 seats. They knew the arithmetic. 71 minus 12 is 59, and 59 is the number of people who are going to be standing on this ridge when the bombardment grid arrives in approximately 4 hours. And 4 hours is not enough time to walk anywhere that is not also inside the grid. I did not make a speech. I did not explain the criteria. I walked through the group and I tapped people on the shoulder and I said, "You, come with me." And the people I tapped got up and followed me, and the people I did not tap stayed where they were. I chose Trake because I could not leave Trake. I chose Drenhall because she knew fleet logistics and might be able to talk our way through whatever was waiting at the other end. I chose a medic named Pellerson, who had been keeping people alive since the 4th week of the siege with supplies that should have run out in the 6th. I chose a woman named Ardette, who was 22 years old and had been fighting since the first day, and who I chose for no reason that I can defend except that she was 22 and the others were not, and I was making decisions that I had no right to make, and I made that one and I would make it again. The rest I chose quickly and I chose badly, and there is no good way to pick 12 out of 71 when the criterion is who lives. I chose the youngest. I chose the ones who could still walk without assistance. I chose the ones who looked at me when I looked at them. It is not a criterion that survives examination. It was the only one I had that was not random, and random would have made it nobody's fault. Vaincord came with us. Not because I wanted him, because I needed him. The shuttle's flight plan was coded to his ident tags, and the fleet's perimeter defense would fire on any unidentified craft approaching the logistics element, and Vaincord's tags were the difference between a shuttle that docked and a shuttle that became debris. He came quietly. He did not resist. He walked to the landing pad with the 12 of us behind him, and his face had the expression of a man completing a task that he has been assigned and does not enjoy, but will perform because performance is what he was built for. I did not say goodbye to the 59. There was nothing to say. Some of them watched us go. Some of them did not. One man, a civilian whose name I never learned, stood up as we passed and said, "Tell them. Just tell them what happened here." I said I would. I said it without stopping and without looking at him. The shuttle was a standard military transport, 12 seats, 2 crew positions, no armament. Velke took the pilot station and ran the startup sequence with the mechanical fluency of a man who has done this specific thing many times, and I sat in the co-pilot seat, not because I knew how to operate a shuttle, but because I was not going to let him sit up there alone with the controls and the option of flying us somewhere I did not want to go. The others strapped in behind us. Nobody spoke. The turbines fired and the shuttle lifted, and Threnhaven dropped away beneath us. And I watched through the forward viewport as the ridge where 59 people were sitting became a line on the ground, and then a shadow, and then nothing. From above, the bombardment looked like a sunrise moving in the wrong direction. A wall of white light advancing across the surface from north to south, each lance strike a pinpoint flare that bloomed and faded, and behind the wall everything was dark and flat and featureless. The topography of the world I had lived on for 28 years reduced to a smooth, glassed plain that reflected the light of the strikes ahead of it like a mirror. Corvinal was gone. The Grenden Highway was gone. The sealant works, the transit depot, the turbine plant, the residential districts, the cable works where I had wound cable for 18 years, all of it was underneath that glassed plain, melted into the substrate, indistinguishable from the rock beneath it. The fleet was not destroying Threnhaven, it was erasing it, turning the word Threnhaven into a coordinate. Coordinates do not have populations and do not require explanations. The shuttle cleared the atmosphere and I saw the fleet for the first time from above. 12 ships in formation, the warships holding station in a low orbit with their lance batteries angled downward, the transports sitting higher, the escorts running patrol patterns on the outer perimeter. From above they looked clean, ordered, purposeful. A fleet performing its function with the institutional competence that the Imperial Navy takes a great deal of pride in, and the function was the systematic destruction of 40 million people and the world they lived on, and the fleet was performing it well. Velke flew us to the rear logistics element, which was a transport ship called the Ardavan Hall Court, sitting in high orbit about 600 kilometers above the sterilization zone. He transmitted his IDID codes and the perimeter let us through, and we docked in a shuttle bay that was clean and lit and smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the 12 of us stepped out of the shuttle onto a deck that had never heard of the Grenden Line, or the sealant works, or the ridge where 59 people were waiting for the sky to fall on them. There were 20 men on that deck when the ramp came down, and every one of them had a hellgun up and shouldered, and a line painted on the floor 4 meters from the ramp foot that we were told to stand behind and not cross. Nobody shouted. It was done in the tone of men running a procedure they had run several hundred times that week. Our weapons went into a bin. Ardette had been silent for the entire flight, and the silence had been doing something to her that was visible in her hands, and when Velke stood up from the pilot's seat, she went for him with a bayonet I had not seen her draw, and 20 hellguns came off us and onto her in a single movement without one man on that deck saying a word. Drake caught her arm and said, "Not yet." Velke walked past them both without reacting. He knew the ident codes were the only reason he was alive, and so did we. When the bin was full, a junior naval officer came down the line and asked us politely to follow him. Processing. That word again. But this processing was different from the ground-side version, or at least it was different for us, because we had arrived on Vanecourt's shuttle with Vanecourt's codes, and that placed us in a category that did not involve a wall. We were debriefed, individually in small rooms with recording equipment and scribes, and the scribes wrote down what we said and did not react to any of it, because scribes are trained not to react, and the things we were saying were the kind of things that training exists to protect against. Before the debriefing, there was a medical, blood drawn from the arm, a light shone in each eye, the back of the neck pressed with something cold, and a man in a hood who read the results and made a mark and did not speak to any of us. I took it for shipboard quarantine and did not think about it again for a long time. I told them everything. The siege, the bombardment, the processing points, the containment, Vanecourt. I told them because the man on the ridge had asked me to, and because I had said I would, and a promise to a dead man is the only kind of promise that costs nothing to keep and everything to break. I told them I had struck Colonel Malton Vanecourt in the face in his own command bunker in front of something over 40 men, which, under the Munitorum articles, is one of the 4 offenses a field court is not permitted to reduce below execution. The scribe wrote it down at the same speed he had written everything else and asked me to continue. Nothing came of it. No charge was laid, no court convened, and no officer ever put the question to me a second time. It took me a while to work out why, and when I did, it was not a comfort. To lay that charge, you must first place on the record that 40 armed provincials walked past his guards into a sealed command position, stood at a live display table with the bombardment grid running on it, and listened to the whole of the containment briefing start to finish. The blow is the smallest thing in that sentence. He could have had me shot only by describing what he had let happen first, and he understood exactly what a document costs. I saw him twice more on that ship, in a corridor, and once across the mess, in a clean uniform, with a data slate, going somewhere. He did not acknowledge me, and I do not believe he was pretending. By every measure the fleet used, he had completed a difficult posting and come out of it with his codes, his equipment, and 12 screened survivors he had not been required to bring. I do not know whether that was decency or efficiency. That is what the debriefing was worth. They listened, they wrote it down, and they filed it. I imagine it is in an archive somewhere, a data slate in a storage facility on a world I will never visit, one report among millions, indexed, categorized, and accessible to nobody with a reason to look for it. The Imperium does not suppress truth. It files it. I was on the Ardavon Hall Court for 6 days. During those 6 days, I slept in a berth, ate food that was not chalk, and walked through corridors that were climate-controlled and structurally sound and populated by people who had clean uniforms and regular meals and the calm, unhurried demeanor of people who have never been on the wrong side of a lance battery. On the 4th day, Drenhall found me in the mess. She sat down across from me and put a data slate on the table between us. "I need you to read this." I asked why me. "Because you put me on that shuttle," she said, "and I have been trying since we docked to work out what you put me on it for, and I would rather owe you an answer than a favor." I asked what it was. "Threnhaven's tithe assessment," she said, "the most recent one." I asked how she had gotten it. I am a logistics officer with subsector supply clearance and administratum filing access. I have been looking for this since we docked, because I knew what processing looks like and I wanted to know why it was happening. And the administratum never does anything without a fee, and the file is always in the system if you know the classification codes. She said she had been running queries on the ship's archive terminal for 2 days, searching Threnhaven's administrative record, and that she had found what she was looking for and wished she had not. There were 2 files, she said, and she could only open one of them. The tithe assessment was ordinary administratum record and sat at her clearance. Cross-referenced against it 9 days later was a second docket she could see the existence of and nothing else. No title, no originating office, a classification prefix she had never encountered in 11 years of subsector supply work, and a seal that was not administratum. She said that in her experience, a document you are permitted to know exists, but not permitted to read, is worse than one that has been hidden, since somebody has decided you should understand that your clearance has a ceiling. I read the data slate. Threnhaven's tithe assessment file, which is the document that determines the value of a world to the Imperium, expressed in units of output, population, strategic position, and a dozen other metrics that reduce a planet and everything on it to a number on a ledger. The file was 417 pages long. I did not read all of it. Drenhall had flagged the last entry, which was dated 9 months before the Ork Hulk hit our atmosphere. The entry was a tithe reassessment, filed by an administratum assessor whose name I did not recognize, and whose title was Divisional Evaluator, 3rd Circuit, Veldrin Subsector. The reassessment noted that Threnhaven's manufacturing output had declined by 11% over the preceding decade, that its turbine housings were being produced to a specification that had been superseded by a newer design manufactured on 3 other worlds in the subsector, that its sealant production, while stable, was achievable at lower cost on worlds with direct access to the required mineral feedstock, that its grain bar output was below the caloric threshold for cost-effective interstellar shipping. The reassessment noted that none of these declines had an identified cause, that the shortfalls did not correspond to equipment failure, labor loss, feedstock interruption, or any of the 11 standard categories the administratum keeps for the purpose. That production returns from the Corvinal Manufactoria had been filed complete and on schedule throughout, and did not match the tonnage actually received at the subsector depot, and had not matched it for 9 years. The evaluator wrote that a discrepancy of that shape, sustained over that period, in the absence of any mechanical explanation, indicated that the returns were being prepared by somebody with an interest in what they said, and the recommendation was this: Priority survey, ordo designation, immediate. That was the whole of the last entry. 9 days after it, the second docket was opened, the one Drenhall could see and could not read, and 11 months before the fleet arrived, a sterilization group began assembling at the Veldrin naval base. I did not know what an ordo designation was. I still do not know precisely. I know that whatever the survey found on my world, it was found 9 months before the Hulk came down, and that the answer to it was to burn the ground to the rock and everyone standing on it. Drenhall knew more than I did and told me less than she knew. She said only that there are a small number of findings for which the Imperium does not treat a planet as an asset anymore, and that when one of them is returned, the file stops being about output. She said that the useful thing, from the point of view of whoever was holding the schedule, was that Orks are visible. A world burned to contain a greenskin infestation is a line in a campaign summary. A world burned for what the survey found is a question somebody has to answer. The Ork incursion had not triggered the sterilization. A clerk with a ledger had triggered it. 9 years into a discrepancy nobody on my world knew was being kept. The sterilization group had been authorized, funded, and scheduled before the first Ork spore hit Threnhaven soil. The greenskins had simply provided a cleaner justification, because a world destroyed to contain an Ork infestation is a strategic necessity, and a world destroyed over what the survey found is a file that stays open with somebody's name at the bottom of it. We had not been caged to contain the Orks. The Orks had been allowed to land so that we would be caged with them. Drenhall pulled the transit hazard record afterwards, which is ordinary navigation traffic, and sits at any supply clearance in the subsector. The Hulk fragment that hit Threnhaven is on it, tracked, logged, and updated by the subsector sensor net for 18 months before impact, with a projected intersection that did not change in the last 4. There had been time to intercept it. There had been time to redirect it. There had been time to evacuate. None of these things were done because the Hulk was convenient and the Orks were useful, and a world that is being defended against Xenos is a world that does not ask questions about fleet movements in its outer system. And 40 million people fighting for their lives are 40 million people who are not reading their own tithe assessment. I put the data slate down on the mess table. I sat there for a while. The ship hummed around me, clean and warm and functioning. And somewhere below us, Threnhaven was glassing, the bombardment grid advancing at the pace established in the operational timeline. The operational timeline that had been written before the first Ork set foot on my world, and the 59 people on the ridge were either already dead or would be within the hour, and the civilians in the processing queues were either on shuttles or against walls. Every death on the Grenden Line, every Ork we had killed, every supply shuttle we had prayed for, and every night we had spent believing that someone was coming to save us. All of it had been settled in advance by a man at a desk who noticed that our paperwork did not match our tonnage. 40 million people, 9 years of returns filed complete and on schedule. A survey nobody on the ground was told about, a finding nobody would put a name to in a document I was allowed to see, and a date. The date was the part I could not get past. Everything I did on the Grenden Line, every man I buried and every greenskin I killed, and every night I spent believing that help was coming, all of it happened inside a decision that had already been made and written down and filed. Drake sat down across from me. He picked up the data slate, which still showed the tithe assessment, and he read it, and I watched his face go through the same sequence mine had gone through, which was confusion followed by comprehension, followed by something that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to anger in the way that frost is adjacent to ice. 9 months before the Orks, he said. I said, 9 months before the Orks. They knew the Hulk was coming. I said they tracked it for 18 months. He set the slate face down. Prael would have burned this ship. I said Prael would have burned a lot of things. So would I, he said. There is nothing on this ship that burns slower than Threnhaven. We were reassigned on the 7th day. Standard Munitorum processing. New regiment designations, new unit numbers, new postings. The Munitorum distributed us across 4 different regiments in 3 different subsectors with the efficiency of a man dealing cards, and about as much interest in what hand each player received. There were 11 names on the manifests. There had been 12 of us on the ship. Drenhall was on no list I was shown, and the clerk who handed me my packet had no entry for her and no interest in acquiring one. And when I asked a second time, he looked at me the way a man looks at a fault in a machine he is not qualified to repair. A query leaves a record the same as anything else does. I have never got any further than that. The Munitorum does not keep survivors together, and survivors who know the same things are especially not kept together. Disperse the witnesses, not with violence, not with threats, with paperwork. Transfer orders and transit schedules and regiment numbers, the ordinary infrastructure of military administration used to ensure that the survivors of a world would never stand in the same room again. My new posting was the Arenthal 112th, which was being raised on a world called Tessendren in the Halcourt Reach, and which needed bodies because it was short on experienced riflemen. and I was an experienced rifleman in the same way that a burned house is experienced with fire. I took the posting because taking it was the only option that did not involve a wall, and because I had learned on the Grenden Line that survival is a habit, and habits are difficult to break even when you have stopped wanting to maintain them. I shipped out on a transport. I sat in a troop hold with 400 other bodies bound for various postings across the subsector, and I did not speak to any of them, and none of them spoke to me, and the transport made the crossing in 11 days. I did not sleep well on any of them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glassed plain that had been Corvinal, and the ridge where 59 people had been sitting, and the face of a man who had asked me to tell someone what had happened. And I had told them, and they had filed it, and filing it was the end of it. I arrived on Tessendren and reported to the 112th's intake depot, and a clerk processed my transfer and assigned me a bunk and a weapon and a unit number. And I became a rifleman again in the way that a cog becomes part of a machine, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without anyone asking where I had been or what I had done or how many people I had left behind on a ridge in the dark. The clerk handed me my assignment packet. Standard packet, standard documentation, unit composition, deployment schedule, operational briefing. I opened it in my bunk that evening under a light that did not flicker and in a building that did not shake, and I read the operational briefing, which described the 112th's assigned theater. The regiment was being deployed to a world called Desavar in the Threnhaven corridor, which was experiencing what the briefing document described as an escalating security situation involving greenskin incursion. The briefing noted that Desavar's strategic position made it a priority for containment. It noted that Segmentum Command had authorized a response group. It noted that ground forces were being deployed to maintain defensive posture until the response group arrived. The briefing used the word relief. There was a subsector advisory attached to the back of the packet, stamped with an administratum seal I recognized because I had seen it on another document 6 days earlier. It was a tithe reassessment notice for Desavar, filed by a divisional evaluator, 3rd Circuit, and it noted that Desavar's agri output had declined by 14% over the preceding decade, and that its strategic viability was under review. I put the packet down. I lay on my bunk. I thought about the medical on the Ardavan Hall Court, the blood out of the arm and the cold thing against the back of my neck, and about the fact that I had passed it, and about the fact that I had come off the Corvinal South Rolls and wound cable under that district for 18 years, and stood on the surface above it while the fleet put 4 lance strikes down the access shafts. A man who passes is not a man you shoot. There is no form for it. A man who passes and came from where I came from is not a man you keep, and the Munitorum has never lacked somewhere to put a body nobody wants to sign for. I looked at the ceiling. It was clean and flat and featureless, the way the surface of Threnhaven looked from orbit after the fleet was finished with it. They were sending me to hold another cage.